So I'm not very committed to the labels of left and right, but what is interesting is that if one is going to say that kind of cultural authoritarian view in the neo-traditionalists like Dugin, if that's a right-wing view, as people do say, then it's difficult not to say the same thing about the decoloniality theorists who are espousing such a similar type of theory.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Generalist Universe podcast. My name is Skyhooks Pirandelli. I'm an economist and science communicator from Brazil. And in today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. George Hull. He's a senior lecturer in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. We explored some topics related to his research paper, Epistemic Ethnonationalism, Identity Policing in Neo-Traditionalism and Decoloniality Theory. In the episode description, you'll find links to this paper, as well as to other projects and publications by Dr. George Hull. I'd like to mention that I run this entire science communication project on my own, from recording to editing. So any financial support through the podcast PayPal account is greatly appreciated. You can find the PayPal link for donations in the episode description or use the QR code displayed on the screen. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And if you're listening or watching this on Spotify, be sure to follow and rate the podcast there too. Dr. George Hull, welcome to the show, and thank you very much for accepting my invitation to share insights from some of your research.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Kaio. I'm happy to be here.
Good. So today we'll be delving into your paper, Epistemic Ethnonationalism, Identity Policing in Neo-Traditionalism and Decoloniality Theory, where you draw parallels between Neo-Traditionalism and Decoloniality Theory. So from the paper's title, we can see that one significant commonality between these two traditions is what you've termed epistemic ethnonationalism. So before we unpack this specific concept, could you first explain what is ethnonationalism?
Ethnonationalism, I would say, is the assertion of an ethnic identity, the political assertion of an ethnic identity. However that is to be understood, ethnic or ethnicity can be cashed out in a variety of ways. Sometimes it involves the assertion of the superiority of one ethnicity. Sometimes it's more about saying that an ethnicity has been marginalized and it's about insisting on having an equal place at the table. And I would say that all versions of ethnonationalism insist on loyalty from members of the ethnos or ethnic group as defined. They should act in a way which is loyal to their fellow members of the ethnic group and not defect or become an agent, as it were, of another ethnic group. Now, ethno-nationalism, it need not be the claim that that group, however defined, should become a nation state, which is the case with nationalism. For example, you could be a pan-Arabist or a pan-Slavist without thinking that there should be one nation state for all Arabs or all Slavs. But it does involve usually a kind of conception of the bounds of the ethnicity, as well as perhaps some other kinds of bounds, like bounds of kinship or language, religion, or culture.
Okay, so it doesn't have to necessarily have as an objective ethno state, but it can take that path.
Yeah, sometimes it involves the assertion that a group should become a state, but it need not.
And then comes in the concept of epistemic ethnonationalism. What would that be?
Epistemic, that simply means as regards knowledge or regarding all of us in our capacity as knowers. So epistemic ethnonationalism applies that demand of loyalty to one's ethnic group, however understood, to people in their capacity as knowers. And specifically, it says that what beliefs you espouse, what kind of concepts you use, perhaps what values you frame your ideals in terms of, are properly determined by what ethnic group or ethnos, or putting it slightly more broadly, geographical identity group one belongs to. And that if one strays outside the bounds of what's proper in terms of knowledge and ideas and values for your ethnic group, that's a problem. It means that there's something wrong with you and you can then be criticized for that.
So you would say that epistemic ethno-nationalism is what decoloniality theory and neo-traditionalism have in common. Would that be correct?
Yes,
Okay, so before comparing both and seeing what they have in common, would you mind giving the audience a quick overview of these two theoretical frameworks, starting with Neo-Traditionalism, or maybe even telling the audience what are these two things that we're talking about here, like Neo-Traditionalism and Decoloniality Theory? Are they ideologies? Are they political perspectives? What are they?
I guess they're kind of theoretical schools. Perhaps that's the best way to put it. Neo-traditionalism is best understood by explaining, first of all, what traditionalism is. So traditionalism with a small t, obviously that means a preference for customary ways or resistance to change or something like that. That's not what we're talking about here. It's traditionalism with a big T, a capital T, which is a particular school of thought. René Guénon, Guenon, is thought of as the first person who wrote about traditionalism with the capital T. And it's a little bit difficult to sum up very quickly what it is, but the essence of it is that he was a perennialist in the sense that he thought that there was an eternal truth which is captured partially by all the religions in the world. He himself became a practicing Muslim, but he'd grown up in the Martinist sect and he'd got involved in esoteric beliefs that way. And he also wrote about the traditional truths with a big T, which one can find in the Hindu Vedanta. But the basic idea is that rather than it being about following traditional ways, traditions with a small t, it's that there is one tradition with a big T. And so René Guénon was very interested in this idea of an elite who had the consciousness of this tradition and then could guide others. Then the next big player was a slightly younger Italian man called Julius Evola. And he was, unlike Guénon, he was very much involved in politics. And it's fair to say that he was on the far right. Julius Evola wrote a book called Fascism Viewed from the Right. So that's not somebody who's in the middle of the political spectrum. Certainly he believed in hierarchy. He had that in common with Guénon. And he was close to Mussolini, though he didn't count himself as a fascist himself. Anyway, so with Julius Evola, you get the seeds of neo-traditionalism because he, at a certain point, suggests that there's not one tradition which everybody should be living by, but rather that people from different areas of the world should possibly be living by their own traditions. So in one of his books, he deplores the fact that a series of, and this is a quote, a series of non-European peoples are, quote, renouncing their traditions, which date back for ages and have westernized, adopting the cultural ideologies, political forms and lifestyles of white peoples, as Evola puts it. And that's really what the main character I'm interested in picks up on. And that is Alexandr Dugin, who is a contemporary figure in Russia. He's sometimes been described as Putin's brain, which may be a bit of an exaggeration, but it seems like Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, is aware of his work and has possibly been influenced by it somewhat. But Alexandr Dugin, he explicitly says that the world divides up into 4 or 5, as he puts it, great spaces. And he's using the terminology of a right-wing German theorist, Carl Schmitt. He was a Nazi jurist, and though some people think there's more to Carl Schmitt. In any case, great spaces is his term. Dugin says that there are 4 or 5 great spaces in the world corresponding with an ethnos. So he uses this terminology of ethnos. And in fact, there's a Russian academic tradition of talking about the ethnos going back to people like Lev Gumilov. So he's using anthropological terminology. And he thinks that there is an episteme, so a set of ideas, beliefs, concepts, and so on associated with each of those ethnoses. Now, it's important with Dugin to note that he's also drawing on another tradition, which is more particular to Russia, and that is called Eurasianism. And so Dugin describes himself as a neo-Eurasianist. The original Eurasianists were writing between the 2 world wars, and they were figures like Trubetskoy, for example. I think it's Prince Nikolai Trubetskoy. And he was one of the people who were exiled after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And the analysis which the Eurasianists of the 1920s had was that what had gone wrong in Russia is that it had been mentally colonized. And this connects with the other school of thought we're talking about today, mentally colonized by West European ideas. And that was a process which the Eurasianists thought had started under Tsar Peter I, when he started speaking French at court and introduced ideas from Western Europe into Russia and art of that style and so on. And they thought that the Bolshevik Revolution was just the latest iteration of this mental colonization of Russia by Western Europe. And of course, it's an interesting test case for the idea of mental colonization because Western Europe never politically colonized Russia, so it's purely a mental or ideational colonization. Whereas the Eurasianists of the 1920s, they conceived of the ethnos in terms of a kind of race. So Eurasian people, Eurasian as in the Eurasian landmass, people should have certain ideas and values. People from Western Europe should have certain other ones. Alexandr Dugin, he doesn't associate himself with the idea of race. He wants to give an analysis of what an ethnos is, which draws on the philosophy of Martin Heidegger. So the neo-traditionalism that I'm looking at, I guess it's not the only one, but it is Eurasianist neo-traditionalism because it's become quite influential in the hands especially of Alexandr Dugin.
Okay, and then we can explore decoloniality theory. So a quick overview of it. And then I would also like to know from you, like, how did you come with this perspective of comparing both? When did you realize that they had something in common too, like neo-traditionalism and decoloniality theory?
Yeah, okay. I can probably explain both of those things together. I'm from the UK. I did my PhD in London, UCL. And part of my PhD work was looking specifically at the way that power, or what the workings of power can tell us about what we should believe or what we should be skeptical about. And I looked at that in connection with the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, because he has a book called The Genealogy of Morality. What's interesting about it is why he thinks that he needs to tell the history of the development of modern post-Christian morality in order to critique it. You might think, can't you just critique it from first principles? He thinks it's very important to look at history. And I argued in my PhD thesis that was because he thinks that the way, not just individual psychology, but also social dynamics of what people are pressuring others to believe, what being aware of those dynamics tells us about what we should be skeptical about in our own beliefs in the present day. Now, when I came to South Africa to be at the University of Cape Town in 2013, soon after that, there were the protests, the Rose Must Fall protests in 2015, which was initially about removing a statue from the campus. And then it became about this theme of decolonization of the mind and specifically of the curriculum. And both of those elements, taking statues down, campaigns to get rid of statues, and also the idea of decolonizing the curriculum, decolonizing academic studies, they then became global phenomena, but I think partly spurred by what happened here. And so I was interested to look at, because it wasn't the first time that people had thought that there was an epistemic dimension to colonization and therefore also decolonization. And some of the theories which people came up with, for example, in Ghana, the philosopher Kwasi Wiredu spoke about what he calls conceptual decolonization in philosophy, so my discipline. It's a similar thing to what I'd looked at in my PhD, in the sense that it's about looking at the way that power can distort or create blind spots in academic fields of study and in our thinking in general. And so that's the way that Kwasi Wiredu pursues this idea of conceptual decolonization. Now, decoloniality theory is something a bit more specific. It's also an approach to the question of how do we conceive of the mental or intellectual side of colonization, and how do we conceive of how we would undo that. But rather than seeing it purely in terms of the workings of power, decoloniality theory does something similar to neo-traditionalism, or at least the Eurasianist neo-traditionalism, because it divides the world up into groups, geographical groups, with which it associates particular ideas, values, beliefs, and concepts. And the reason for that is kind of a strange origin story, as it were, because the figures in Latin America who came up with decoloniality theory, and so that's people like Aníbal, Quijano, Peruvian sociologist, Walter Mignolo, who's an Argentinian literary critic, Ramon Gross-Foguel, who's a Puerto Rican sociologist, and Nelson Maldonado Torres. They were, I think all of them, it's fair to say, were initially dependency theorists, which is a school of Marxism. And it's specifically the idea that you have to understand capitalism as a global phenomenon rather than a national phenomenon. And so dependency theory says you can't think of the stages of development, economic development, going through feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and so on, as Marx describes them, as national phenomena. You have to understand it as a global phenomenon. And so the dependency theorists, they said, well, in the mid-20th century, you had global capitalism, where there's a division of labor between the economic core, which is the industrialized countries like North America and Europe, principally, and then the periphery. And the periphery countries, they provide raw materials, and then they have imports of the value-added manufactured goods. And they're never going to get out of that position of dependency, of being the providers of raw materials and the importers of finished goods from the core of the world economy, unless they delink. And delinking is the prescription for how to get out of a situation of economic dependency that you have in people like Raoul Prebisch, Günter Frank, and then Wallerstein, who incorporated dependency theory into his world systems analysis. And what happened in the 1990s was that the decoloniality theorists, they said delinking is still the answer, but economic delinking is not enough. And for a successful economic delinking from global capitalism to take place, there has to be a prior epistemic delinking. So that changes what delinking means entirely, because it's no longer about what gets produced where. It's no longer about essentially imposing tariffs and in protecting domestic industry, refusing to import cheaper manufactured goods from the core of the world economy. It becomes rather about discarding or refusing to countenance certain ideas based on what? Well, just like with the core of the world economy, where they're from. So Walter Mignolo describes this new kind of delinking as delinking from Western epistemology. So it's no longer from the core of the world economy, it's from Western epistemology. And so once you describe delinking like that, you're forced to apply geographical labels to ideas or worldviews, because otherwise you don't know what to delink from and what to embrace on the level of ideas and values. Now, so there's perhaps one more ingredient which is important to mention, and that is the concepts which Aníbal Quijano, who I already mentioned, brought to the table. So he was a co-author of an article with Emanuel Wallerstein, who was very much a world systems analysis scholar. But he thought that you couldn't give a purely economic characterization of the world system, the economic world system, because he thought that the idea of race played a structuring role in the sense that the division of labor between core and periphery relied on people. There'd been a widespread belief in the idea that the human species divided into races, the idea that they formed a hierarchy, and the idea that certain kinds of work belonged with certain racial groups. And so he, analysing the situation in Latin America, he thought that what had happened from the 16th, 17th century onwards is that enslaved people from Africa would be counted as black and they would be doing compulsory slave labour. The indigenous people of the Americas were often in semi-feudal situations, in situations of peonage, a peon for a padron. And then wage labour was more or less reserved for white people, Europeans, or people of European ancestry. And he thought that kind of racialized division of labour was essential for the maintenance of the world system and specifically the division of labour. Now, what the people who came after Quijano did was they took that idea and they said this idea of a race hierarchy, that's kind of an epistemic aspect to colonialism, or as they put it, coloniality, because this was something which could carry on after political colonialism had come to an end. So what that tells us is that in order to undo coloniality, this is how Mignolo Grossfogel would put it, one must not only dismantle the hierarchy and create a more egalitarian political system, the hierarchy of people, but one must also dismantle the hierarchy of knowledges. They like to talk about knowledge in the plural, where the European colonizers had imposed their, as they would put it, knowledge. This is the Western epistemology, which we talked about earlier, delinking from. And that would include things like this idea of a race hierarchy. But they would then push to the side the indigenous knowledge systems of the people in the areas which they colonized, whether that was in Latin America or, of course, Africa, Asia, or wherever it was. And so Quijano described the role played by the race hierarchy in the division of labor globally as the coloniality of power. But Mignolo and Gross-Vogel, and then also theorists from elsewhere in the world who become part of this decoloniality theory network of scholars, like in Zimbabwe, he's from Zimbabwe, but now in Germany, Sabelo and Glovigasheni, Madina Tlostanova, a Russian theorist, and in India, Sai Deepak. All of those people think that, as well as what's called the coloniality of power, which is the hierarchy of people based on a race hierarchy thesis, the myth of race, there's also what they call the coloniality of knowledge. And that's the idea that European knowledge was imposed as being the superior kind of outlook and what people should aspire to, and other worldviews were pushed to the sides. So undoing the coloniality of knowledge is identical with delinking from Western epistemology. And so that's how you get from a Marxist dependency theory, which is very much about economic dependency and economic sovereignty, was the goal of the dependency theorists in the 60s and 70s. You've now got to something which is much more is to do with the intellect, the mind, getting rid of one's, or ceasing to be an adherent of values, ideas, concepts, ways of framing things, which are now thought of as Western epistemology.
And that's exactly what this last point is exactly what they have in common with Neo-Traditionalism. Would you say that both doctrines assert that knowledge and beliefs are ethnically or culturally bound? Would that be the case?
Yes, that's right. So the way that Alexandr Dugin, in his theory of Neo-Eurasianism, puts it, is that each ethnos has a particular way of being in the world. And there he's using language from the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. And that's why there are certain concepts and there are certain values which are right for people from that ethnos, and other values and other concepts which are right for people from a different ethnos. And so an example would be that Alexandr Dugin claims so he wrote a book called The Fourth Political Theory, where he sets this out. And he says that during the transition after the USSR, there was a big problem because a lot of Russians, but also people in newly independent Georgia, Ukraine, and other countries which used to be part of the Soviet Union, were embracing liberalism and democracy. And those are values which Dugin thinks are right for what he calls the Atlantic ethnos, which comprises Western Europe and North America, but not right for the Eurasian ethnos. And so that tells you something interesting, which is that when epistemic ethno-nationalists claim that certain ideas belong to a particular ethnos, or ethni, as Quijano likes to say, they're not saying that they're necessarily the ideas which are currently most prevalent or most popular among the actual people that they're talking about. It's quite possible for most people in an ethnos to have ideas which are not right for them. And then the theorist, in this case Dugin, would criticize them for that. Then comparing that with decoloniality theory, you have this same idea. Maybe it's quite nice to compare it to the figure of the comprador in dependency theory. So in dependency theory, the idea is that the periphery countries of the world in global capitalism are kept in a situation of dependency. They're just supplying raw materials and then they have to import all the value-added goods from the core, partly because of the existence of a class in their own territory, which is called the comprador, so a kind of merchant. And this is somebody who facilitates the export of raw materials and then the import of the value-added goods and pressures their governments to keep up this economic situation of dependency, which is ultimately going to be not in the best interests of their country. Now, for the decoloniality theorists, the comprador, though they perhaps might not use that word anymore to describe them, takes on a different character. This is somebody who, though they are in, say, an African country or in an Asian country, they are thinking and speaking as though they were. This is the kind of language which Mignolo, Gross-Vogel, and Glovigasheni use, as though they were European. And so that's what you might describe as an epistemic comprador. And that's somebody who's in the same situation as in Dugin's Neo-Eurasianism, a Russian or a Georgian who was advocating for liberal democracy, not the proper values for their ethnos, according to Alexandr Dugin. Similarly, this kind of epistemic comprador figure is somebody who has not sufficiently delinked from Western epistemology. And for as long as there are a lot of those sorts of people around, according to decoloniality theory, well, no delinking from Western epistemology is going to be possible, and therefore also no delinking from the other sorts of oppressive or exploitative relations which exist will be possible.
So would you say they both promote identity policing because of that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way of putting it. Alexandr Dugin, he's very clear that you can't convert to another ethnos in neo-traditionalism. It's not like a religion. By changing what you believe, you don't end up being a member of another ethnos, because what he calls your deep identity remains the same, and it's on that basis that he can say that you don't have the beliefs which are proper to your ethnos. With decoloniality theory, they're a little bit less explicit about the kind of divisions that they are describing when they talk about Western epistemologies and African epistemologies, or Andean time, Andean conceptions of time, for example, as Mignolo sometimes talks about. They're as clear as Dugin is that knowledges or worldviews and value systems, they come with flags attached, as it were. They come with their geographical labels. So an example would be Sabelo Ndlovu-Gasheni, the Zimbabwean decoloniality scholar, when he is talking about the theorist Olufemi Taiwo, who was born in Nigeria, who is an advocate of liberal democracy, so again, quite similar to neo-traditionalism. He criticizes him by saying that this is somebody who is enchanted by Euro-modernity, so kind of has been seduced away from the proper values or ideas that he should be espousing. So that's, you can see a parallel between the kind of criticism based on identity which the two theorists make of people who have, what are in their view, the wrong values or the wrong ideas for their geographical identity group.
Okay, so they have an essentialist conception of identity, right? So in neo-traditionalism, it kind of gives you a path for that, where you go to when it comes to finding your identity. But in decoloniality theory, this is not quite clear, right? They're not very specific when it comes to what exactly would be the source of your identity.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Dugin, he uses this word ethnos very explicitly, and he theorizes it. Now, the decoloniality theorists, they do use the word ethni. Specifically, Quijano, he uses the word ethni. And let me see if I can find what he says. Yeah, so this is Aníbal Quijano. He says, nothing is less rational than the pretension that the specific cosmic vision of a particular ethni should be taken as universal rationality, even if such an ethni is called Western Europe. So he uses that ethnic language as well, and Walter Mignolo likes to quote that passage a lot. But what you don't find is them theorizing what an ethni is. I mean, so that makes us think, what should we say about this? And I think that what the decoloniality theorists are essentially doing is they're taking it for granted. Rather than making it an explicit thing which they theorize, they're taking it for granted that there are African knowledges, there are Andean or South American knowledges, there are Asian knowledges, like always using knowledge in the plural. That's how they like to express themselves. And so what you might describe that as a moral geography, in this case, a moral geography of knowledge. And what a moral geography is in social science is just, it's usually an assumption that, for example, certain people shouldn't be in a particular place. And it doesn't have to be theorized, it just has to be something which is taken for granted. Similarly, in decoloniality theory, rather than there being a big theory of what kind of groups these ethnies are, it's just taken for granted that certain knowledges belong with certain ethnic groups. And it's on that basis that one can talk about such a thing as delinking from Western epistemology. It would be impossible to delink from Western epistemology if there were no such thing as Western epistemology.
When you mentioned the rejection of universal truth or rational standards in both of them, and you also mentioned in your paper that at the same time they're asserting universally applicable critiques. Could you explain a little bit or expand a bit on that?
Yes. So let's start with decoloniality theory, because, so as I said, that comes out of dependency theory, which is, as a school of Marxism, it is a universal theory. They're trying to state principles which are true across the board, which can be confirmed by examples all over the place. And so there's a grand narrative there, essentially, which is about how the world is made up of these regions which are in an exploitative relationship with one another. And then it prescribes a remedy for that, which involves economic separation. Now, decoloniality theory, it wants to keep on that grand narrative. And indeed, That is always touted by the decoloniality theorists as what distinguishes their theory and makes their theory better than post-colonialism. So they are quite critical of post-colonial writers like Edward Said, Gayatri Spivak, and other theorists, and probably Akhil Mbembe as well. People who actually want to get away from having a grand narrative, a grand universal narrative of history or a sociological narrative of the way the world works. Decoloniality theorists do want to maintain a grand narrative, but at the same time, they want to delink from Western epistemology. And it's actually this overlaying of a kind of somewhat postmodernist approach to truth and objectivity, so criticism of objectivity and universalism, overlaying that upon a theory which has roots in universalist Marxism, which creates a big tension, the tension which you noted, in fact, at the heart of decoloniality theory. Because when they talk about delinking from Western epistemology, Walter Mignolo likes to talk about there being no truth without parenthesis. In other words, any claim that something is true or something is factual or a value is legitimate needs to be put in inverted commas or bracketed. It's true relative to a particular context of utterance, the context of the West, if it's Western epistemology. And he says, one conception of what time is might be true for the West or valid for the West. He likes to use the example of time, the concept of time. He says that when the Spaniards colonized the Andes, they imposed their conception of time. So again, associating a concept of time with a particular ethni. And he asserts that the Andean conception of time of the indigenous people of the Andes was something very different, but their conception of time was colonized by the other. There, he wants to assert that both of them are right, though they apparently disagree, both of them are right, because one of them has a conception of time which is true in parenthesis relative to the European or West European context or ethni, whereas the other is true or valid relative to the Andean context. So that raises a problem because we have this grand narrative about how a colonial matrix of power involving the coloniality of power, the coloniality of knowledge, which I've already mentioned, and also what Nelson Maldonado Torres calls the coloniality of being. And that is a system which describes the whole world. So it's just like the Marxist vision of economic exploitation. It is meant to be objectively true for everyone, everywhere. And that obviously raises the problem. I thought there was no truth in parenthesis. Or why don't you tell us, Mignolo, which ethni, which part of the world, which regional identity group that grand narrative of the colonial matrix of power having been put in place and staying in place for the past 500 years is true relative to. But of course, they don't really want to do that, Mignolo, Grossfogwell, and the other decoloniality theorists, because they want to maintain that grand narrative. And so there's a tension there between maintaining that grand narrative of the colonial matrix of power and their assertion that, as Ndlovu Gatsheni likes to say, everybody is born into valid and legitimate knowledge systems. In other words, all the different knowledges are true and they're true in parenthesis. It's difficult to maintain both of those positions at once.
Right. And it's also the case that one of the critiques I've heard around decoloniality theory is just that the Western perspective with the Western culture would also be an ethni, right? So it should be respected as one
Right.
valid source of knowledge, and then is not taken that way by decoloniality theory. Would you say that is also a valid point, a valid critique?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that maybe the best way to bring out what you've just said is with that race hierarchy thesis, which I mentioned Quijano contributed to world systems analysis, because he's very clear that when Westerners began to divide the population of the world into 4 or 5 races, and then to create a hierarchy, that is false. Race is a myth. It's not just the hierarchical aspects of it, but the very idea that there are clean racial divisions among the human species. He's very clear that has nothing to do with the realities of human biology. But then, as you just said, when Mignolo and others talk about the coloniality of knowledge, they seem to associate the idea that the human species divides into races with Western epistemology. And yeah, just as you said, doesn't that commit them to saying that even those ideas are true in parenthesis, they're true for Westerners? So on the one hand, Quijano, quite reasonably seems to want to say that it's outright false. It's totally false that there is this race hierarchy, and that seems the correct position. On the other hand, by saying that Western epistemology is true in its in what Mignolo calls its proper localism, he likes to say that all ideas are true in their proper localism. That seems to mean that you're forced to concede that it has some kind of relative truth, which doesn't seem like a position any theorist would want to be in.
Also, in the paper, you talk about egalitarian discourse in both of them, decoloniality theory and neo-traditionalism. Can you explain a little bit or expand on that a bit?
Well, so I guess egalitarianism in politics is the idea that humans are fundamentally equal. We're not all equally good at various things or equal the same height or that sort of thing, but we're all morally equal in that we're all worthy of consideration. We all have certain rights which have to be respected, and that kind of idea. And we should all have opportunities to make something of our life. So that's egalitarianism, I suppose. So decoloniality theory is clearly an egalitarian theory in the sense that it wants to overturn the hierarchies associated with capitalism and also colonial racism. So it's egalitarian in that sense. But it's also egalitarian in an epistemic sense, because it wants to overturn the hierarchy which it describes as the coloniality of knowledge. So it wants all knowledges or all kind of outlooks, all sets of concepts and beliefs, or all epistemes, they also use that language, to be counted as equally valid and legitimate. But it's an egalitarianism of a special kind, because the decoloniality theorists do not argue that in all parts of the world all knowledges or all worldviews should be equally espoused or equally taught or equally broadcast, because, as I said, they always link geographical labels to each worldview, each knowledge system. And so it's a kind of separate but equal egalitarianism which they have in mind for knowledges, because, as we talked about before, they want to be delinking from Western epistemology. Well, that means you leave Western epistemology in its place and you have African epistemologies in Africa and Latin American ones in Latin America and so on. So that's the kind of egalitarianism which they seem to be espousing, which leads to what you talked about before, which is the identity policing. Because if you're espousing the wrong knowledge for the place that you're in, that's a problem. As Walter Mignolo likes to sum it up, you are where you think. That's his way of putting that. Now, for Alexandr Dugin, even though he comes from this traditionalist with a big T school of thought, which tends to valorize hierarchy. So, for example, Julius Evola, as I said, a far-right thinker in Italy, he wanted to revive what he described as a knightly order. He wanted there to be rule by knights, according to the tradition with a big T in Europe. But Dugin, in a sense, because he picks up this idea that there are different traditions with a big T in different parts of the world, he does assert a kind of egalitarianism, because he thinks that each ethnos should be entitled to live according to its own tradition with a big T. He describes the imposition or the importation, or however you want to put it, of Western or Atlanticist ideas into Eastern Europe and Russia and Central Asia as a form of racism, a form of violence, epistemic violence. So he uses that sort of language as well. And so, just like the decoloniality theorists, he espouses a kind of separate but equal egalitarianism for the epistemes of each different ethnos. Having said that, on the other hand, it gets a little bit complicated, because you might ask, what about if the value system and the ideas of a particular ethnos is itself inegalitarian? And in fact, that's something which Dugin countenances, because he thinks that rule by the Tsars, for example, was something which is more suitable to the Eurasian ethnos than it would be to the Atlanticist one. So again, there's a kind of tension with precisely this concept of egalitarianism, which you're homing in on, because if you're going to say that everybody is born into valid and legitimate knowledge systems, which is a quote from Nglovi Gasheni, what about if they're born into a knowledge system or a system of values which is actually inegalitarian? And that's a kind of tension which is never satisfactorily dealt with by the two schools that we're talking about.
It also when it comes to their perspective on Western knowledge, right? They also have an opposition to modernity and liberalism. Would you say both of these theories would assert that they oppose modernity and liberalism as a whole?
Yes, I think probably that's true. Though they have slightly different ways of coming at that point. The traditionalists, even before Neo-Traditionalism, were against modernity and against liberalism. And Julius Evola was very clear in his writings that the explanation for why the tradition with a big T disintegrated in Europe was because of the revolutions which brought in liberalism, the French Revolution and then the revolutions in the middle of the 19th century, which were essentially against absolutist rule, saying that individuals, no matter what their birth is, should have equal political rights. So that was the beginning of the idea that all individuals should have the same sort of rights. Now, with Neo-Traditionalism, Dugin's Eurasianist traditionalism, it gets a little bit more complicated because he does say things which sound very much like Julius Evola's critique of liberalism, critique of the revolution. But on the other hand, he talks about the Atlanticist ethnos, which is Western Europe and North America, as being an ethnos which is entitled to live according to its way of being in the world and should have the ideas and the values which are suitable to it, which include liberal values. Whereas Evola was just against liberalism, Dugin ends up being both for it and against it. He's for it in the right place. So modernity is conceived of by the traditionalist and the neo-traditionalist as a departure from the primordial tradition, though it's also a little bit complicated because they don't think that the tradition with a big T was ever realized fully in any place anyway. Okay, for the decoloniality theorists, their criticism of modernity is slightly different because they, so Mignolo, Quijano, Ramon Gros-Foguel, Maldonado Torres, and Lovic Asheni, all of these theorists, they would say that modernity and coloniality are two sides of one coin. They're inextricably bound up with one another. One of the ways that Walter Mignolo likes to speak about this is by saying that one side of the coin is the rhetoric of modernity. In other words, all of this talk about equal rights, democracy, equality, that's the rhetoric. But the logic, in other words, how things actually work, is coloniality. And that means the colonial matrix of power, the division of the world hierarchically, and the division of knowledges hierarchically as well. So their criticism of modernity is for being inextricably bound up with coloniality. As for liberalism that claims about human rights, Walter Mignolo, he is a little bit ambivalent about that kind of liberalism conceived that way, because I think he's resistant to coming out fully against human rights. And so rather he will say that these are kind of concepts which have different versions in different areas. So democracy might mean something different in Asia from what it means in Western Europe, for example. But the main criticism of modernity is that it's bound up with coloniality.
Would you say they're just theories or they have political aspirations?
Alexandr Dugin is a theorist who clearly advocates for a particular politics. And so he is a Russian, he's resident in Russia. He wrote a textbook which was prescribed by the Staff College in Russia. His idea is that the Eurasian ethnos comprises not just the territory and the population of Russia, but also that of many Central Asian countries and also Eastern European countries, including Ukraine. So he's explicitly supported the incorporation of Ukraine into Russia, or at least its political subordination to Moscow. And he has a basis, as he sees it, for that kind of politics, because he thinks that they comprise one ethnos, which has one kind of being in the world, which is different from that of the other ethnoses. So there's a clear political implication there. And also, he criticized the movement towards a more liberal democratic system in Moscow and indeed in other post-Soviet states on the basis that not that these ideas are totally false, because he thinks that they're right for the Atlanticist ethnos, but rather that they're not Eurasian, they're not sufficiently Eurasian. So there's clear political implications there. As regards decoloniality theory, it really seems like because of the structural similarity of the theory, it must have quite similar political implications. So if you think that there's a particular kind of political thinking which belongs to the West or Europe or North America, then presumably the prescription to delink from Western epistemology will include a prescription to delink from that kind of political thinking as well. Now, the theorists, people like Walter Mignolo, Grossvogel, they're not so explicit about advocating a particular political platform on the basis of it, but you can see there could be political implications for that kind of theory.
Other than all these topics we explored here, is there a shared language between these two theories?
Yeah, there is some shared language. It's now true that both Dugin and the decoloniality theorists use the language of colonization. And as I said, that's actually something which goes back further in the Eurasianist tradition, which he's part of. He describes himself as a Neo-Eurasianist, and the original Eurasianists were clear that the Russian mind had been colonized by the West. And that's something which Dugin agrees with, and of course that's also a claim which the decoloniality theorists make. Dugin takes some of his language from the writers of what's called the German Conservative Revolution. So Dugin is inspired by Oswald Spengler, for example. And Oswald Spengler is a theorist who divides the world into he thinks that the world is made up of organic civilizational wholes, which go through a phase of growth and then decay. And so Oswald Spengler wrote a famous book called The Decline of the West, in which he was claiming that that Western civilization was in its time of decay. So Dugin uses that language, and he also uses some of the language of Carl Schmitt, and that's also true of Walter Mignolo. Dugin uses the concept great space from Carl Schmitt. Mignolo uses the concept of the pluriversality, which is also from Carl Schmitt. And what's interesting is that that's language which is also used by the European New Right. So people like Alain de Benoit, they will talk about being in favor of pluriversalism, or the pluriverse, which is the idea that each region of the world has its own kind of ideas which are not universal, but rather one should endorse pluriversality, which is the idea of truth in parenthesis. So there are some interesting overlaps. And another thing which is interesting about that is that Carl Schmitt is usually thought of as a thinker of the right, but the decoloniality theorists, they come out of Marxism, which is thought of as a school of thought on the left, and their anti-colonialism they think of as progressive leftist thought as well. But there is this sort of convergence, both at the level of what we've been talking about mainly, which is the kind of structure of the theory itself, but also some of the concepts. And so it seems like some of the theorists that they're inspired by, there's a kind of subterranean common inspiration from the theorists of the time of the conservative revolution in Germany.
While reading your paper, one thing that came to mind was Horseshoe theory, which, from time to time, someone always brings it up just to talk about how similar the extreme left is to the extreme right and so on. So in this case, we have decoloniality theory that we can say comes from the radical left or the extreme left on the political spectrum, and then Neo-Traditionalism as something that is coming from the extreme right, from the far right of the political spectrum. So what do you think of this idea of the horseshoe theory, and do you think it makes some sense given some of your findings from your paper?
Yeah, so there's the idea that, so one example of that is at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution in China in 1966, there was a member of the Communist Party who warned the Red Guards that what they were engaging in, though they thought it was leftism, was actually going to make them rightists. And he was somebody who said a circle consists of a left semicircle and a right semicircle, and going too far to the left, you end up on the right, which I think is the horseshoe concept as well you're talking about. I'm not sure whether that applies across the board, because if you take one particular thing, like let's take egalitarianism, or let's take egalitarianism in terms of opportunities. Should people have equal opportunities? We generally think it's a leftist view that one should equalize opportunities, and a rightist view that actually inequality of opportunity is okay to some extent. If you equalize opportunities and you advocate for more and more equalization of opportunities, it doesn't seem to me that you suddenly become right-wing. That continues to be a leftist position, and you can insist on it more and more. On the other hand, what is true is that whether you're on the left or on the right, the more you insist on compliance with a policy, whether it has to do with egalitarianism or cultural uniformity or whatever it might be, the more likely you are to use certain methods which are more authoritarian or more repressive. So what I would say is that Rather than that showing that if you go far left, you end up on the right, what it shows is that those categories of left and right that we use, they're a bundle of different values. And the way that those values are collected together can shift and change. And I think that's happening a lot at the moment in general. So, for example, if you take the United States of America, there's been a number of shifts. The Republican Party, which is thought of as the rightist party, always used to be in favor of free trade and the free market and not too much protectionism or too much regulation and or welfare. But that's not the case now at all. On the other hand, it has more kind of conservative family values policies like it used to before. The left used to be much more absolutist about rights, such as a right to free speech, than it is now, and that's more associated with the right. So these different values, which are collected in baskets, which we call the left wing and the right wing, they can actually get jumbled up in ways that, even over the course of a decade or two, in ways which can surprise us. So I think maybe that's what's coming out more, that these categories like left and right, there's no inherent affinity between the different values which are collected in the basket of the left or the right at any given time. And that's what we're seeing with these theorists as well. But I mean, what I would say is that, so the idea that we should be, as you were talking about, we should be policed in terms of what values we espouse, or what beliefs we have, what fundamental concepts we use based on what our identity is, what ethnos or ethni we're told that we belong to. To me, that is a kind of a somewhat authoritarian idea, because it's telling people what to think. So it has that kind of character of repressive or authoritarian behavior, or a potential for that kind of behavior, which is more associated, I think, with the right wing, in the sense that it's about policing a kind of cultural community. So I'm not very committed to the labels of left and right, but what is interesting is that if one is going to say that kind of cultural authoritarian view in the neo-traditionalists like Dugin, if that's a right-wing view, as people do say, then it's difficult not to say the same thing about the decoloniality theorists who are espousing such a similar type of theory.
Yeah, I see how complex this can be, or just to state that they're just becoming the same thing is way more complex than that. And how is science seen under these two theories, decoloniality theory and neo-traditionalism? Do they have similarities when it comes to also seeing science?
So you mean like science as in natural science as opposed to social sciences?
No, I mean more like science as something objective, as something that depends on universal standards in order to compare things and to reach or to advance knowledge. How do these two things see science?
To be honest, it's not the favorite example. So certainly like physics experiments or physics theories, or biological theories, they're not the favorite example of either the neo-traditionalists or the decoloniality theorists. But on the other hand, they are committed to a particular view, which is that knowledge, or the view of physical reality, of natural reality, is something where there's only truth in parenthesis, in Mignolo's terminology. And I suppose they would probably take the line that even our observations of natural phenomena are already overlain with or charged with assumptions and content which is specific to a particular worldview. So they're committed to taking that position. And the decoloniality theorists, they do often speak about cosmologies, for example, which I suppose is a proper study of science because it means the whole universe. But they don't go into very much detail except to say that there are cosmologies which belong to the African region of the world, cosmologies which belong to the Andean region, which Mignolo speaks about, and also ones which belong to the West. They tend not to go into great detail, and the same is true of Alexandr Dugin.
Okay, so would you say that when it comes to social sciences, that they should have more of a saying when it comes to analyzing social sciences than other sciences, because you tend to analyze cultures, and then comes in anthropology, sociology, and so on?
Yeah, those are their favorite areas to theorize about. That's where their examples tend to be taken from, and also, I suppose, political ideas.
And do you see them as influential in academia today? These two ideas, or one stands out in terms of that?
Yeah, they're influential in different domains. As far as I understand it, Eurasianism today is very much associated with this figure of Alexandr Dugin, this Russian theorist, and he is quite influential. And he networks with political groups in Europe, or he used to. I don't know whether that's the case anymore. So as Alain de Benoit, who I already mentioned in France, the doyen of the French New Right, he is somebody that Dugin, I think, has corresponded with, and there are some affinities between their ideas. So the New Right in France, they're involved in putting forward an idea of Europe as a civilizational space, and they see themselves as defending European values and that sort of thing. And that clearly has affinity with Dugin's view. So his influence is much more in politics and kind of political discourse. Whereas the decoloniality theorists, they have so far at least been mainly influential in scholarship. And I think they're very influential. Walter Mignolo, especially, he's a professor at Duke University. He's written a lot of books, The Darker Side of Western Modernity, The Politics of Decolonial Investigations, and people are citing them all the time. Here in South Africa, as I say, I became aware of decoloniality theory as the protests were going on about Rhodes Must Fall, removing the statue and curriculum change. And my university, the University of Cape Town, there was a curriculum change framework which was put in place, which explicitly draws on what they call Latin American decolonial theory. So that's the kind of place where it's very influential.
Is there any political influence in South Africa coming from decoloniality theory or even Neo-Traditionalism?
I think there's certainly a degree of epistemic ethnonationalism which is present.
Okay.
And one of the areas where that plays out is in law. So thinking about the law. And that's also true in India, by the way, where Sai Deepak, who I mentioned, who wrote a book called India That is Bharat, which is a citation from the start of the Indian constitution, I think. But anyway, so he has argued that the legal system in India reflects coloniality, and he thinks that the law in general should be reformed in line with what he describes as Bharati civilization, or Indian traditional Hindu specifically values, because he's part of the Hindutva school there. Now, in South Africa, there has been something similar, a criticism of the South African constitution. So in South Africa, of course, there was a legalized sort of white supremacy, including the apartheid system after the Second World War, which was only properly dismantled in 1994. And in 1994, there was a provisional constitution when there were the first democratic elections. And then the full constitution was brought in a few years after that. And there have been a number of kind of attempts to critique. I mean, a lot of people are very positive about the South African constitution because it enshrines not only political and civil rights, but also some socioeconomic rights. And so it's seen as giving very good protections to individuals as long as the state can come through with those. But there have been some lines of critique of the South African constitution as a legal framework. And initially it was about whether this was actually going to be a way of bringing about radical change, whether property rights should have been enshrined so fully into the constitution or not. But lately, in the last few years, there's been another school of critique which says that the South African constitution is not sufficiently African or Azanian, as it's sometimes put, and that it reflects a kind of Western or European mentality instead. And that became part of the platform of a new political party last year when there were the general elections. The former president, Jacob Zuma, who was he was a member of the African National Congress, and he was a president. As president of the country, he was also president of the ANC. But he then broke away and formed his own political party. And they explicitly put that in their election platform, that the Roman Dutch law, the traditions which informed South African law, should be looked at again, and the foreign basis for the legal system should be rejected. So that's an area where this idea that there are particular ideas and values, including the values which should inform the legal system, which belong to particular areas of the world, that's coming through in politics in South Africa and also in other countries like India.
And after your extensive research on these topics that we explore today, and especially comparing both, understanding both Neo-Traditionalism and Decoloniality theory, what advice would you give to academics or policymakers when navigating identity-based political views like the ones we explored here today? What is the importance of understanding everything we talked about today?
I think one of the important things is that ideas do have power, they do have influence, and they even have influence on people who are not necessarily reading the books by the theorists we've been talking about, for example. because the fact that a kind of idea or an approach, a political approach, it is something which people know that there's some professor at a university who writes a lot of books and has come up with some theory vindicating, that can give people confidence in taking a political line which they otherwise might not have done. And so that's one reason why it's relevant even for people who do not read these books. I think the other thing which I think is important in this discussion is that decoloniality theory, that's a particular approach to the idea of decolonization of the mind. And just because that approach doesn't hold water, or it's not defensible, it has these kind of internal tensions that we've been talking about, that doesn't mean that the idea of intellectual decolonization should be thrown out. As I said much earlier on, the fundamental idea of intellectual decolonization is that the exercise of power internationally can distort the ideas that we come up with. And I think there's an important truth in that. And so we should examine the impact of power relations, including colonial power relations in the past, of colonization on the ideas which people take for granted or the way that curriculums are structured. So maybe a way of summing up that would be to say that we need to separate out the idea that the impact of power on knowledge needs to be interrogated. We need to give a kind of audit to our ideas based on whether they've been influenced and taken the shape they have because of power relations. That's one thing, but that doesn't mean that we should tie knowledge to identity, which is a different thing. And that's exactly what the decoloniality theorists have done. So interrogating the effect of power on our ideas is not the same thing as saying that we should adopt ideas based on who we are, based on our identity. And I think the two can be separated out. And that, for example, the Ghanaian philosopher Kwasi Wiredu, who I mentioned earlier, is an example of somebody who has an approach to decolonization of the mind, which respects that distinction between interrogating the effects of power on ideas and associating ideas with particular identities. Because his idea is we should look at the areas of theory and the areas of our curriculum which are the way they are because of colonial influences. And we should be very careful to check whether those ideas are ideas we do wish to espouse, or whether there's some alternative which would be better supported by the evidence. That's very different from saying that we need to get rid of foreign ideas. Two things are totally different. So I think that is a problem in the contemporary discourse about decolonization. So decolonization nowadays, when people use that term, they're more likely to be referring to curriculums of schools and universities, or museums, or art, or general approaches to things, rather than politics and economics, which used to be the domain in which people talked about decolonization. And I think there's sometimes an assumption that decolonization means getting rid of the foreign and valorizing only that which is indigenous. That doesn't have to be what decolonization of the mind means. And there are other approaches to it. Keep these two thoughts separate. Number one, that power has influenced knowledge, or indeed culture or ideas, in a way which is a problem and needs to be reviewed and responded to. And number two, the idea that different identity groups, or different geographical groups, or different ethnoses have different ideas or culture or art which are proper to them, and there's something wrong with them if they depart from that. That is a problematic idea. That's the identity policing which you mentioned earlier. And that's the kind of approach to decolonization which I think we should be wary of. If people take that distinction into account, I think that makes the discussion about decolonization a lot more constructive.
Okay, and based on your experience, or just sharing your experience debating these topics in the academic environment, are people open to these discussions, or there has been a lot of pushback when it comes to criticizing these ideas? What has been your experience with that?
It's been variable. To some extent, it's been positive, because I think some audiences that I've talked to, they've already had a nagging feeling about decoloniality theory, whether it's Walter Mignolo or Sabella and Lovic-Acheni, or however they've been reading, that there's something wrong here, or there would be a better way of going about. If we think about decolonization in the mental or intellectual sphere as something legitimate, that there might be a better approach to that. On the other hand, I think some audiences, I found they're already locked into the idea that decoloniality theory is the correct approach. I think one of the dynamics there is that the decoloniality writers, they tend to want to recruit everybody else who's written about decolonization of the mind to their school of thought. It can make it a little bit difficult to distinguish between one approach to intellectual decolonization like Kwasi Wiredu's and a different one like Walter Mignolo's. And then, of course, as academics, people write and sometimes they have said in print that they approve of Walter Mignolo, and then it's very difficult to walk back from that. So that can be a problem. But generally, I would say that some people can be resistant, but one generally finds people who are quite reasonable and willing to talk about these things open-mindedly. So I haven't found that it hasn't led to me being cancelled yet.
Okay, Dr. George Hull, thank you very much for coming on the show. I'll leave links to some of your papers, especially the paper that we explore here today, on the description of this interview. And thank you for coming on the show once again.
Thank you for having me.